Well, first, thanks for that wonderful introduction. And in a way, you've got it. That's the argument in a nutshell. We'll see if I can deepen it a bit. Gail, thank you as well for your hard work with the Academy. It's been a pleasure. There are a group of people in this room who are fellows who know what I mean. It's been terrific. It's a great place to work. Oasis of inspiration and tranquility. That's hard to put together usually. My fellow fellows, good to see you here. The Holtzbrinks, thanks very much for making this possible. Okay, on with the show. So I just want to start with this sort of bizarre image as a proviso. There are many, many different ways to talk about algorithms. One can talk about them as mathematical structures. One can talk about them as engineering problematics. One can talk about them in terms of modeling behaviors, of data structures. There are lots of ways to go at them. And which one is correct? I mean, it depends what your point of view is. It depends what you want out of it. In my case this evening, it really is going to be about their cultural space. In other words, their role in cultural production, but also their role as a cultural artifact, their place in the larger culture. Another proviso is one can take the long view or the close view. I'm going to opt for the big picture, the telescopic view, with the risk that were I to switch to a microscope, this invariably happens in Q&A, like, well, there's a detail here that, that's revealing, and it's true. It's just a different set of optics. So I am going to be a little crude. So depending on what you know or don't know, this may sound a little roughshod or may sound just fine, but I am going for the big picture in this talk. Third, the real action in the domain of algorithms is in governance. Governance and finance, which is a kind of governance. And I'm not going to be talking about that. Transmediale was just here a month or so ago. A lot of good papers, a lot of good work looking at this, whether it's NSA or whether it's predictive policing or whether it's algorithmic trading on Wall Street. These are the shapers of our world, the people that are designing these algorithms, the people that are thinking about how to model them, what the data feeds are. So crucially important, it's not what I'm going to be talking about. I know this is where the debates are, but I think the value of looking at culture is that it reveals something different about the character of how we imagine algorithms to function, what they might be. Less print spent on it, and I think in a way more revealing because it moves from a kind of governance issue to an affective set of issues and challenges, I think, the notion of human identity a little more centrally, at least as far as I can tell by public response. So I don't find a lot of people complaining about the loss of human agency when it comes to their stock portfolio. But in the New York Times article about algorithmic newspaper writing, there's huge concern about the loss of human touch and human agency, and what does that mean even? So I think culture offers a special space to talk about the work of algorithms, and that's why I'm not going to be doing this. Although this is absolutely the big picture, the big story, the thing that's really we need to watch carefully. Nearing the end of the provisos, but this is an important one. Nick Seaver has done a lot of good work. He's at Irvine, and he's boiled down a lot of the concerns about algorithms into these two categories, access and expertise. When you talk to people about algorithms, a kind of typical response is, yeah, Google, Facebook, they've got these algorithms, they change the formulation like all the time, and they're secret. They're legally protected secrets, right? If you knew what they were, you could game the system, you could really have fun with Google. But that's not going to happen because these are secrets. And therefore, access is a big deal because Goldman Sachs and Google and Amazon are all protecting their algorithms from scrutiny. This seems to many scholars to be the kind of barrier to entry. Access is a problem. It is a problem. Expertise, where one given access, is the follow-up problem. Okay, look at our algorithm. Google has, in fact, said, here's a 5-year-old algorithm. Have fun with it. Well, it doesn't work because although an algorithm is, in fact, a simple thing, I'll use the analogy again, something like to compare it to a brick. What we're talking about here are skyscrapers. made of millions of bricks, or maybe at least hundreds of thousands of bricks. Not only that, algorithms pose some very serious epistemological problems. For example, personalization algorithms. If you use Google Now, that is sort of funneling all of your Google mail and mapping and location, all of that's being fed in, and it personalizes. It's telling you how long it's going to take you to go to a place you haven't even told it you're going, but it's right. It tells you about your packages that are coming in the mail from Amazon. It tracks it all, puts it together, personalizes it. How does one talk intersubjectively about a highly personalized structure, an algorithm that's working for me? Epistemologically, how do I broaden that out in a way that I can share with other people? Might work for me and not for you. That makes it tricky. Secondly, algorithms are constantly in flux. There are usually multiples. When you call a phone, when you call to complain about your washing machine not working, and you get a recording, at least in the States, that says this call is being recorded to improve our service, what's happening is that call is being recorded to assess your type as a customer. And there are multiple algorithms that might be at play here. You can't pin it to one, so that the next time you call, you're funneled directly to the person who handles difficult people, or not. So the point is, there are so many. It could be one of a dozens or maybe even hundreds of algorithms. They're constantly trying them. They're constantly optimizing them. Bing, you could be using up to one of 10 million algorithms at any given moment in a search. So it's a very tricky thing to pin down to the wax board and analyze. Epistemologically, this is a real challenge to scholars. So I think, yeah, access and expertise are issues, but there are far more fundamental issues that have to do with the way these things operate in our world. Okay, so let's start with the quiz. Which of these is, which do you think are algorithmically? I'll give you a second or two to read it here. Two very different strategies, data-centric and maybe more affective. How many people think the first one is written by an algorithm? Okay. How many think the second one is written by an algorithm? Even fewer people. A lot of people who aren't thinking it through. Well, you know what? They're both written by algorithms. And the trick was the framing of my question. I said which suggested one or the other. That framing trick is fundamental to the operations of algorithmic modeling. Someone models an algorithm and they pose a question. And they might pose a which question, or they might pose another kind of question. All to say these are loaded strategies, just like this was a loaded question. These things are pervasive. Your bank card, your car key, your camera with facial recognition systems. Whatever we do is pretty much these things inhabit that space. Correctly or incorrectly, it's a little hard to say. But if one were to boil down the definition of what exactly an algorithm is, it's a recipe. It's a formula. It's a formula that has a finite end. With this coffee breaker recipe, you can ramp up. Instead of 1 cup, you can use 3, and as long as you scale everything the same, it works. It's a formula. So it's slightly more technical definition, set of rules, usually algebraic, not so much in the recipe form, and something that's very much picking up these days as computation picks up, but more on that in a second. And if one were to look at what algorithms in fact do, it's not all that complicated. They classify things. They determine what something is. Is this melodic sequence copyrighted or not copyrighted? Simple question. Is it a copyrighted piece of music? Or ranking. Are you likely to hijack an airplane? Should we stop you and pull you in for secondary questioning? Should you be high on that list or low? Association. Something is similar to. This is a very tricky one with predictive policing. Filtering. What will you see and what won't you see? Which of your Facebook friends will you actually get to see today? Which feeds will be put through to you, and how does that get sorted out? So these are, of course, each of these is a little brick, and lots of these little bricks are put together into, these modules are put together into complicated systems. So it's not like just one is used, a lot are used. But if one were to speak about basic functionality, basically this is what they do. Algorithms are old. This is not a new thing. Euclid used an algorithm to distinguish odd and even numbers. I mean, this is and they've been around forever. Pascal, Leibniz are both working with algorithms. There's a long kind of simmering history of algorithms as a mathematical conceit, as a mathematical project. But if we use the algorithms of Google's Ngram to sort of track where they are in that 6 or 7 million books that Google has digitized, you can see pretty clearly that it's around the late 1950s that the use of the term blasts off. And that has to do with three things. One thing is data, right? The era of big data. This is about a year old, so don't be impressed by these numbers. They're far more dramatic this year. And what's important to remember about data is that data in no way, I mean, what does data represent? Data it's an artifact. It's a piece of information. It can be garbage. It can be nonsense. So the quality of data greatly matters to what will happen in what an algorithm is capable of doing. If you feed it nonsense, it will spew back nonsense. But the structure of data is also crucial. Data comes in many different structures, and algorithms can work efficiently, inefficiently, whatever. So this is a space that really matters. And obviously, the kind of data we're collecting can only work with some sorting system, something to sort of parse it very quickly and make sense of it. That brings me to the second thing that's happening, processing power. Moore's famous law, which he backdated to 1958, tells us that the processing capacity of transistors will double every 2 years. Now, doubling, you can understand why the phone that you're forced more or less to buy a new computer and new phone every couple of years. Why memory sticks the memory stick, I don't have it in here, but if I were using it, it's more than the Apollo 13 had by a factor of 3. So this is growing exponentially, which means speed of processing, memory capacity, all that stuff. And on the other hand, the third element of this triad is transmission speed, because this is all fine, but if you have to go to the big computer to make things work, this is not going to make much of a difference. But the speeds are getting ridiculous. And this was maybe 2.5 months ago in Eindhoven. 32 terabytes is big. And this is really starting to ramp up right now. The speed wars are growing also exponentially. So we're in a very, very interesting space. And this is what gives algorithms their power. If it were that simple, I could stop. Tarleton Gillespie has sort of assessed the terrain and how people talk about algorithms, and he's come up with these kind of 3 categories. He says a lot of people use the word algorithm as a synecdoche, a part for a whole. What they really mean is something far more complex. They don't just mean the formulation of the algorithm. What they also mean is the modeling, the data, the application, the works, in other words. So that's slippery because you're never sure when you hear the word someone's referring to an algorithm, which piece exactly they're referring to. Is it the algorithm in a strict sense, or is it this bundle of related activities? A little hard to disambiguate, but nevertheless disambiguatable. What exactly do they mean? So there's a lot of misuse. There's a lot of that kind of use of the term. Secondly, he sees it as a kind of a talisman. And this is usually invoked in the claim for objectivity, right? Well, the algorithm says, what do you mean the algorithm says? It was authored, the data was selected, the thing was modeled. What do you mean but that's a very common usage, as if somehow by being a computational strategy, it has a status that's holier, more neutral, more objective than a human. And I'll show you some examples where that preference feeds into the cultural factor. Sometimes it's just used to refer to Facebook. Oh, the Facebook algorithm. And finally, this is something that's very much about procedure, a commitment to procedure. That is to say, computational procedure becomes part of the human process, part of the ways in which our ideas of knowledge and societal being and interaction are formalized. And it's what we go to sort of sort out our problems. Okay. So these kind of complicate things because one is, when you see the word invoked in print, it's a little hard to know. I mean, you have to think, you have to sometimes really calculate what does the author really intend here, which of these meanings. So things to remember. One, algorithms are authored. They're modeled. There's usually a modeling process where someone has questions. They figure out how to sort of bake those questions into a formulaic expression. And it's taught, there are classes taught on this. There are textbooks written about it. This is a craft. This is, or craft, I demean it. This is a mathematical achievement, but it's not magic, is the point. What starts to look a little bit like magic, though, is when machine learning enters the picture. And where we are now is a point where, for example, self-optimizing algorithms enter the scene. So, for example, chess. To program a computer to win at chess, well, it takes a little time. You can just put in every mathematical possible variation, and okay. But you can't do that with poker. There are too many unknowns in poker. In fact, you've got to teach the machine how to learn and what to valorize in the learning process. So actually, you're not programming it for every variation. You're programming it to effectively think. And as self-optimization starts to kick in, algorithms are writing algorithms. Algorithms are improving algorithms. And that's a very intriguing space, to say it as neutrally as possible. Second thing, there's a really very interesting, if I were starting school again and wanted to make money, I would become a lawyer specializing in algorithms. Because there are huge questions here of agency. So this is Knight Capital. I think 2012, there was this so-called glitch where Knight Capital basically lost $500 million in a couple of hours, dropped the whole stock market by 10 or so points, lost 75% of their value. And it was like, and when they caught it, it was like, whoa, turn this thing off. And oh my God. And so then the question is, well, like, who's responsible? You've just lost $500 million, $500 million. Like, hey, this was a technical fault. This wasn't we didn't do this. It's an error in the machine. The machine screwed up. So let's just set the clock back, give us our money back. Like, we didn't lose anything. It's all a game anyway. It was a very interesting set of debates ensue here over responsibility. So whose fault is it? Is it the author of the algorithm? Is it the guy who was supposed to test the final composite package? Is it the person who's supposed to be watching, the person asleep at the switch? Like, where is agency? And if we think about a world of self-driving cars or drones or you name it, where is agency? This is an extremely interesting and important question, and it's provoked by this. As I already mentioned, algorithms, any particular algorithm is actually part of a far bigger mass organism, structure, whatever you want to call it. So that's no big deal. Tools. What a great picture. Tools are great. So yes, algorithms are tools. Someone designs them to do something. They don't grow wild in the world. They're designed to actually do something. But they're also getting a little too complex. And as they start to create themselves, they're entering, again, a space that's kind of interesting. And in a way, they become less tool and more technology. And Latour comes to mind. He has this notion of interobjectivity. What separates humans from monkeys? In simian culture, you might say, well, they have a robust social life. I mean, ants probably have a robust social life. When you look at their organization, it's pretty rich. So what distinguishes us? And Latour, in this particular piece written in the end of the 90s, mid-90s, says, well, actually, it's things like walls and clothes, these borders, these structures that humans put in, these objects that are kind of between us and the world we inhabit. That's a bad gloss of Latour, but Latour is notoriously tricky to gloss. But I think if there's any bottom line to this talk, you've already gotten a hint of it, that what characterizes the long modern, is a very clearly defined set of object-subject relations. My stance to the world is what it's all about. And these are, I would argue, between me and the world that I encounter. They're between me and the text that comes in on my phone. They are, in fact, shaping that text. So it's that stance, it's that sort of presence of something in between. And I don't mean it like ideology, some false consciousness, but there is a structuring agency now between me and much of my informational experience of the world. In fact, determining whether I'm a good citizen or bad, whether I'll be shot or not shot, whether I can fly on a plane or not, it matters. And it's that shift. We don't see it very well, I think. I think we still look at the world as text, but I think this idea of interobjectivity is one that's ripe to maybe revise or pull out of Latour and do something with. And finally, algorithms are terrific for the kind of, this is the article that Margaret mentioned, terrific for provoking reflection. So I think what's to say there, 282 letters or comments when I took this frame shot. And I read all of them, and they're intriguing. I mean, to the letter, appalled by this idea of billion. Last year, something like 1 billion algorithmic stories were basically sold and circulated. So 1 billion, that's a significant number of stories out there in the world. Journalists are alarmed, of course. There are books, I hate to say, there are books, full books authored by algorithms already, kind of mundane books, how treating your Doberman pincer or whatever. But what shows up in the letters is two main points. One is, besides the fact that this is a horrible idea, one is the question of what does it mean to be human? Is this somehow challenging our humanness? Is this eroding some sense of human agency, some sense of understanding? Is this like a fake version, someone aping what a story looks like? Or does this have, and the other is what's intelligence? Is intelligence a uniquely human capacity, or does that go outside our species? And those of you who follow trends in posthumanism or object-oriented ontologies or even thing theory, if you're into that space at all, you know that there are people who think intelligence, consciousness, all that kind of stuff is slightly more diffused than human-centric, and that's where the Copernican-like decentering is. This is a really wonderful provocation to think. Okay, so I have to go a little quickly. Next few slides, basically what I'd like to show are some images of algorithmic art where the algorithm is effectively being used as a kind of tool. In the sense that an artist has an idea and an algorithm is used sort of in lieu of a paintbrush. The artist is disaggregating the artistic act from like idea, sort of conception through execution, and is focusing a little bit more on conception, programming, but stepping back from execution. So kind of untangling that from the creative act. And Roman Veratsko's work is terrific. It's terrific. He does amazing stuff. Herbert's famous manifesto, I'm sure you've seen many artistic manifestos. This was the manifesto for the algorists. So the algorist was the movement in the visual arts, and there are a lot of Germans worked in this space. Nays and Knoll and many others. Music is a space that has this. And these again are not, although I show a kind of computer here, these things go back to the canon form, so Pachelbel or something, right? Where that's an algorithm. That's just a simple formula. Here's follow the rules. Mozart, the musikalisches Verfenspiel is really an algorithm of a sort. But Eno says it, I think, quite well here, this way in which he wants to be a planner and programmer and then step out of his role and let it happen and listen. Hiller, there's a really rich tradition here of algorithmic inspired music. Elliot, for all I know, you're a practitioner as well? No? Sometimes. Okay. I should have checked before. And if you're interested in this, you can get the latest edition of Band in a Box and make it happen yourself. There's something really striking about this. I mean, in the photographic domain. And it reminds me very much of early film and photography, although this is using a different technology and not making the same indexical claims that some might mount for photography. But that sense of uncanniness that people greeted those first daguerreotypes with, like, have you captured a soul, or what have you captured? What about those fleeting images? This has it's a spooky image. And by the way, it's a huge image. It's much larger than you're seeing it here. It's like would probably cover the front wall of this room in absolute pristine detail. It's a very striking image. So the whole issue of what it constitutes realism and whatever, it's all here. This is happening. One of my labs deals with this. And if you're interested in this stuff at all, this is a fabulous resource that we built with hundreds of interactive documentaries, interviews, tools, you name it. In documentary domain, there's a lot of interactive work where both the documentary itself, you're pathing through it, is kind of algorithmically configured. There's some emergent examples of that. But the site itself configures itself to your interests. In other words, what you actually see itself is the result of some algorithms. So it's not just the text, it's the access to the text. So there's kind of a double algorithmic layer here. But it's a fast-growing space. And the world has the lean forward types and the lean forward and sit back. This stuff is great for lean forward types. But for lean back, having an algorithm go through a textual environment to pluck out a narrative rather than someone click their way through is probably the next big step in this space. And it reminds me very much of, again, the debates about photography. Abby Warburg, and for any of you who were here for Christopher's talk, that's Abby with the mustache. A huge question over mechanical reproduction. When film and photography both enter the world, they are not legitimate aesthetic forms because they're made by machines. So is that our problem with algorithmic expressions of art, that somehow the machine did it and the artist didn't? It echoes in my ears to that. Artistic legitimacy is a really important issue here. Issues of display, of what the algorithm is being asked to do. Is it trying to emulate in some way known art forms, or are we trying to liberate it to find other things it can do? I think we're still very much in the stage where we're emulating what we know because we can still inscribe it within the aesthetic in that way. Okay. Switch from art and the use of algorithm as tool to culture and the ways now, today, in which algorithms are entering this mix slightly differently. This is a really perverse article. Forbes is not a friend of the New York Times, and what they choose to print, they choose to write the bad news about the New York Times tanking. This was back in 2012. And if you look at who wrote the article, it's Narrative Science. This is an article written by the enemy of the New York Times, Forbes magazine, a pretty conservative venue, saying the Times is on the way down. And who writes the article? An algorithm. I mean, that just twists the knife a little bit. This is from the website of Narrative Science, and you can sort of see they just mine data, they storyfy it. That will be a term I'll use again and again. You maybe heard gamify. That was the big word 2 years ago. We're very much in, I think, a storyfy moment. How can we make this a story? How can we narrativize it? Epigogics is a really intriguing company. Like many of these companies, in fact, the prediction companies, it's really a modified form of weather forecasting software, in fact. But Epigogics, this is so, I mean, how can you quote Aristotle and have a guy squeezing a brain? There's something wrong with this image. But, oh, this is being streamed, right? I'm going to be a little more polite. Epigogics' business model is to, you feed it a script. You get the digital printout of a movie script, feed it in, make a few casting decisions, and Epigogics, their algorithms will tell you what you can expect in terms of box office return. And like 2-3 years ago or something, they were hitting about a 70% correct rate. Now, Hollywood people are the counterparts of connoisseurs. They've spent their lives in this business. They understand it. They've got a nose. They can smell it. They know what's going to hit and what's going to sink. And they hit pretty well, too. But this is what investors like, because a computer did it. It's more objective. So there's kind of a culture clash here between the Hollywood insiders who know, or that's their business, that's why they're there, and the computer, the Epigogics folks who are doing it somewhat differently. But it gets more complicated because now we have algorithms that actually can construct the film. They can analyze the visual data, they can do an audio analysis, and then they can think about where the story bits might fit. So editing is about to undergo a transformation. If you put this together with just the data point of image recognition technologies are getting much, much sharper. This was a fairly dead space for a while. It was kind of a simmering, slow space. And in the last year, there have been some remarkable achievements, just to show you. This represents a quantum leap over where image recognition technologies were. What this means is that computers that claim that they can manipulate imagery, tell a story, that can only work if you know what's in the image. That was always the missing link. That link has now been resolved, or is in the process of being resolved. And it's really an interesting space to watch. Oh, so you miss human feeling, huh? Is that the problem? Engineers are great. I live with engineers at MIT. I'm a humanist by training. But what I love about engineers is they're really they're very calm people, and they say, well, so you're afraid that there's no emotion here. Well, what do you mean by emotion? Like, let's just tease that out. Let's figure out what it is exactly you're missing, and we'll build an algorithm for it. Why not? Why wouldn't you? I mean, it's an engineering challenge. They like the challenge. And it really does force a very interesting discussion. I mean, we can say we feel, I'm sure you've all heard those aesthetic debates about the perfect fake and the real, and somehow the perfect fake, even on an atomic level of perfection, is ridiculous, and the other has all the value. That's an interesting debate, and I don't know, but that's kind of this debate. These guys just say, tell us what molecular pattern you're after, we'll make it. So it's a very, very interesting kind of dialogue that's starting to happen here. Again, that forces us to look back on ourselves. Newspapers are doing a lot, and what's interesting here is not so much that they're doing it, but that the stories themselves they're not stable stories. They're actually environments where you can go through and sort of see how your income fits with this story, and you get a different story than someone else might see. These are, the Guardian has been doing terrific interactives, which are basically algorithmically defined and driven interactive stories. And very, very intriguing, but a very different idea of journalism from the truth. This is a company called Echo Nest that basically does sound prediction. It predicts taste in music and shows up in things like Spotify and Pandora, both of which will give you the music you want. And of course, this raises all the dilemmas, as all these personalization technologies do, of the echo chamber. Because basically what you get is what you got. We extrapolate from where you've been to figure out where you go next. And that kind of is a fairly constraining strategy. But it's a strategy. Anything that keeps the customer happy seems to succeed. And that's, of course, the business model here. These companies' algorithms are all about prediction and recommendation. And to be honest, I do use the Amazon, I do turn on my cookies for Amazon until Maria screws around with my computer. It's perfect, and then it starts to give me a lot of things I'm not interested in. But normally, it's really, really quite accurate in terms of so those are kind of examples in the world right now, and you've seen them. But the question is, if we understand more sharply what algorithms are and what they're capable of, maybe we can push a little more in our expectations, in our hope of what we might do with them, what we might expect. Just a couple, I have to really be brief here, a couple of examples. So yeah, if you were to look up augmented reality, for example, urban augmented reality, you will find on Google image search, you'll find page after page of up there in the top. Starbucks, advertisements, it's all about like how close am I to the nearest Coca-Cola or whatever. Okay, fine. I mean, but I think there are really alternate, interesting ways to think about this. Why couldn't you use that same technology to add layers of historical information or event information or even messaging to location? In this case, it's a project one of our labs has that is appending stories of Italian immigrants to Boston. And it's putting up photos and records and career, whatever people don't mind being public. But it makes walking through these neighborhoods quite rich because you suddenly understand that the shabby building you're looking at has a very interesting set of people and a very rich history and what a kind of economic trajectory or not or whatever. So knowing where the nearest Starbucks is can also be very useful, but there is another domain of knowledge. We have archives full of stuff let's bring it back to the world and append it to the places where it has meaning. This is a great, I don't know if this company, does anyone know, are they still around? It's a Berlin-based company. Art Plus Com. This was a project where they took films, reality films, like what you're looking at on the Leipziger Straße is a 3D version of a tracking shot down the street. The camera just went down the street. One shot. I think this is from like 1911, that particular film. There's the film. And they've spatialized it. And then they make a series of time maps, and they embed these objects on it as spatial artifacts on a two-dimensional map. And then you can collapse the maps, and you can see where the history of films taken on Berlin streets through the ages. It's a beautiful tool, a brilliant idea, a terrific way to think about archiving and making the archive publicly accessible. If you're a critic of, let's say, British Petroleum or of advertising or whatever, these guys have gone out and they've sort of hacked it all and made sort of political commentaries. If you're at the Biennale and can't get in and don't think that's a good idea, you can construct a virtual pavilion, which is what this particular AR team did. Miku, have any of you heard of Miku? So this is a crowd, basically this creature, started her life as sound synthesizing software. It's a Japanese company, they make vocal, you write a song and then you like plug in your song to the software and it will sing your song. And you can kind of pick, like Siri or something, there's a voice and you can sort of modulate a little bit. And then people started to draw fantasy pictures of who this voice belonged to, Miku, Hatsune Miku. And then they started to animate it. And then the company built a kind of crowd-owned environment for this. It's not owned by the company, it's owned by everyone who participates. And Miku is now doing live performances. She did a big one in LA, 50,000 people, live band, animated, projected. So, okay, it's a kind of crazy example, but it's a very intriguing example of a kind of collaboration that we could not have thought about before this particular turn. More serious applications, you might look at SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Life at Home. This shackles together hundreds of thousands of home computers that are not being used. When you're not using your computer, the power gets shuttled together to search for extraterrestrial life. They expect a breakthrough in the next few years. It's been going on for about a decade or so. Firefox, Linux. These are all endeavors where people come together, intellectual property is opened, and collaboration occurs that's really intriguing. And from our world of like very individual silos into something that's kind of collaborative, this is only possible thanks to the algorithmic dimension. And it's not new, of course. Our cultures have always been collaborative, but what happened at the turn of the 20th century is that the heavy industry of media appeared. The big film companies, the big press, the big publishers, big broadcasters. And they've dominated the 20th century. They're now in a rapid state of decline or reconfiguration. But it means that with those big trees gone, a new kind of undergrowth can come up. So I think we are able now to recapture some of the collaborative, our cultures of course are collaborative, and they're not trademarked or copyrighted or protected. I think it's not exactly a circle, we're not back where we started, but we're spiraling. We're in a kind of reaching the same space, but with a different set of technologies, a different set of enablements. Okay, big picture time. This is a legible image, I take it. You look at this. Now, none of you have been to the moon, I know. And yet it's a legible image. We can kind of tell we're on the lunar landscape looking at Earth. And it's legible because it conforms to image strategies, representational strategies that's our way of seeing, right? 3-point perspective, we understand. That's how we see. We think it's natural. We don't think we learned it, although there's some debate about that. Heidegger hit this so squarely on the head it hurts. His assessment here is a brilliant, I think, a really pithy and for Heidegger clear, at least for my reading of Heidegger, clear assertion of what's the modern. The world picture is not a picture of the world, but the world conceived and grasped as picture. The world picture does not change from an earlier medieval one into a modern one, but rather the fact that the world becomes a picture at all is what distinguishes the essence of the modern age. And I think he's so right about this. And here's what I would point to. The birth of the modern in the 15th century, with two technologies within, 15 years of one another. Alberti publishes the De Pictura, which is the sort of all about three-point perspective, what the world looks like from me, how I see the world, not the medieval, not the world he's inhabiting where you get symbolic sizes and symbolic representations, but something that we would say is a naturalistic, an I-centered world. And 15 years later, Gutenberg comes up with the press, which amplifies, which radiates, which takes the ich, the I, in book form and gets it out there to the world. Now, what's really intriguing about this, well, we'll talk about that later. We'll come back. You'll see this picture again. So to me, this is the birth of the modern, the great modern, because it's a moment when the self, the individual, is pulled out of this mass of a sort of God-configured world and sort of thrust out there, and we see our technologies starting to articulate and sharpen that. So, the whole rise, the Dutch are really terrific with these perspective studies, and it turns into our building strategies. Our mathematical formulations conform to help reify, articulate, deepen this I-centered world. Canaletto, this is legible. We know where he stood when he painted this. Even our spectacular, this is a cut through of a panorama, even our most, sensational kinds of imaging systems, even Oculus Rift today, is all about me and what I see. But here's where we are. This is Photosynth, Microsoft product. This is old Photosynth. If you go back to look at it, they now use it just to do panoramas. This thing takes hundreds, like up to 800, 900 photos taken by different people, with different cameras, different lenses, different days. As long as they're tagged Piazza San Marco, the program, the algorithms will kind of comb through them and look for points of uniqueness. This is the dot cloud, where it's finding all these points where images might correspond to one another. And they come up with this seething. Well, at first on your computer it looks like a picture, except you can kind of move into it and move out of it and go left and right. And if someone took a picture of two mosaics, you can zoom in to those two mosaics. This is a collaboratively authored photo. Now, the whole world of media studies is predicated on point of view. All of our work is about whose point of view and what are the implications of that point of view. What the hell do you do with 800 points of view in one image? It's like talking about authorship with Wikipedia. Well, it's a good system, kind of. It works. What do we do? Who's the author? How do we talk about that? It's not like the author's gone. You can find the individual photos. You can find the sentence that I wrote because my little edit mark is there. But in the aggregate, it's really something else. So this would be to sort of summarize the big difference between the modern, the big project of the modern from the 15th century till now, and kind of where we're headed. The modern has been about a fixed point of view. It's been about attribution. I know who said it. I know who did it. If they're wrong, I know who to sue or to ridicule. It's authored, again, part of attribution. It's stable. We expect our textual systems to be the same. Now, we know that Shakespeare does change a little over time, but people have battles about it, and they fetishize it. And it's all about a very well-defined subject-object relationship. In contrast to where we're going, which is very much about multiple point of views, multiple and simultaneous, attribution that's very hard to pin down, collaborative endeavors rather than individually authored endeavors, a very unstable and ever-changing textual situation, and this intermediation that's algorithmic. So in other words, man the measure is not the measure anymore. Man the center of the planet is not the center anymore. And again, it should be clear here, if there's a mistake in Diderot's encyclopedia, I know that Monsieur Diderot should have one minus mark against him. But Wikipedia, why teachers, I hear some of my colleagues, well, you can't trust it. It's who wrote it? Who do you say, who wrote that article? And well, it's not going to look that way tomorrow. Someone may edit it and change it, right? The instability, the attribution, that's the problem with it. And yet, for those of you who use Wikipedia, if you peel back the page that you're presented with on the screen, if you have editing rights and peel back the page, you see in a moment most of the text is stable and there are places where there's controversy. Isn't that what you want to know when you read something? Where's the controversy? So for me, it's an even superior form, but it's very typical of this new algorithmically enabled culture that we're moving into. Okay. Time to close this thing down. Okay. So just a few things to think about. One is I think we're moving towards what might be called a predictive economy. So a lot of our technologies at the moment, a lot of our uses of algorithms in the cultural space are about prediction. What will you like? What won't you like? What do you want next? And the bind is that the past is the future in this kind of scenario. I mean, I'm a little agnostic about this, good, bad, or indifferent, but it is what it is. Data trails become constitutive. Like these start to build what you will have access to, where you've been. The desires are produced before they even exist as desires. That's a very intriguing space for us to be in, a preemptive economy. Baudelaire has that wonderful quote about the modern where he says it's the transient, the fleeting, and the contingent. He says one half is art and the other half is eternal and immovable. And in fact, his project is to take the ephemeral and turn it into the eternal as art. So he's really about stability. But I think this is a great transience, fleeting, and contingency are really the key words to think about when we think about this algorithmic domain. This is just a great example in photography. The information you record includes a lot of depth information. You can refocus this image yourself. The picture you take on your computer, in your camera, can be at will focused into many different things. There's it's not just an image, there's also the depth that's recorded. So what's the image exactly? It's unstable. It's fleeting in a way. And that's the condition we're inhabiting more and more. So it's constitutive in the sense of what we talked about earlier. This is, by the way, from Ancestry.com, this website that you can dig and find all of your ancestral information. Having done that, what do you do next? Okay, you've got a lot of stuff in a file on your computer. They very brilliantly partnered with narrative science and storyfied it. Let's tell stories about your ancestors. A new story every day. But the point is, these start to constitute events in the world. These constitute narratives in the world. And of course they're interpretive. I mean, although people pretend or think that they're somehow not, of course they're interpretive, but they do constitute something. I love that quote from Lisa Gittleman, "Raw data is an oxymoron." It's the title of a book she did. It's something to always remember. Bottom line, I think we're trapped. We're kind of in this funny space between the two cultures that Snow talked about, C.P. Snow talked about. Because what makes algorithms so special, what we've seen happen so far, is that the mathematicians and the engineers have sort of asked a lot of the soft side questions, a lot of the fuzzy questions, and then figured out how to build tools, how to build algorithms to sort of capture that data. We, on the humanities side, or at least those of us who are humanists, have not looked very closely at the algorithms and tried to flip that equation. It's not like I'm going to write them, but I think we should be able to think far more critically. We need a critical discourse of the algorithmic. And I don't say this in the sense of booing and hissing, and Transmediale was pretty negative about the algorithm. The algorithm is just a program. It's a formulation. It's not the algorithm's fault. But we need a critical stance to pursue this. And the bind is we live at a moment where we have the old public sphere that Habermas talks about. Traces of it are still there. The marketplace is there, the public square. But so is the mall, that funny space that feels public, but in fact is privately owned and privately policed. And we're morphing into this kind of new click space, predictive space. But all three are there at the same time, and it's confusing. Because whatever one of these worlds you're from, if you're a 6-year-old kid, you're probably quite familiar with this, and the marketplace may seem a little exotic. But for someone of my age, I'm kind of at home in all three of those, and I don't quite know that I'm reading them the right way. Reading is about where you stand, and we're standing in a funny space at the moment. So to go back to this image, I feel and it was the punchline on the invitation, or maybe it was there, I don't know. I very much feel like, what did it feel like in 1435 or 1440 to look at these new technologies? If you read someone like Elizabeth Eisenstein on the book, well, this brings order to the world, it transmits knowledge, it regulates everything, problem solved. No, if you read Adrian Johns on the book, he looks at the first 100 years and it's chaos. It's people who collect them but can't read them, put it under their pillow to have the knowledge seep through. Crazy uses, crazy uses. It's people coming from the old regime, from the Middle Ages, encountering these new technologies and looking at them like a horseless carriage. It's a carriage without a horse and it moves. Isn't that great? I think we are at the cusp of one of these fundamental shifts in our culture, and that we read the work of algorithms just like the work of the old textual systems that are so much a part of our lives. But if we look closely and critically, something very different is happening. And with that, it's a little warm in here. I think I will stop. Thanks.